Barron Trump sat quietly in the luxurious first-class cabin, gazing out the airplane window as the evening sun cast its golden glow over the tarmac. The hum of boarding passengers filled the air, but Barron barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. The tranquility of the cabin was shattered by a sudden outburst. "Excuse me, but what is he doing here?" The pilot barked, his voice sharp and commanding, slicing through the serene atmosphere like a knife through silk. His tone bristled with hostility, and all eyes snapped toward him, following the direction of his accusatory glare. It landed squarely on Barron, a young man seated near the aisle, whose presence now seemed to electrify the air. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Conversations halted mid-sentence, cups of coffee hovered precariously, and every movement froze in place. The tension in the cabin thickened, as though the oxygen had been siphoned out of the room. Eyes darted between the pilot, brimming with indignation, and Barron, who sat poised but puzzled. If you're wondering what led to this moment and the jaw-dropping twists that followed, be sure to subscribe to the channel. This is the kind of story you won't believe until you hear it all. Barron, despite the palpable tension, lifted his gaze slowly to meet the pilot's fierce glare. His expression remained composed, his brow slightly furrowed in confusion, but his tone was measured, steady. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough weight to convey both respect and resolve. The pilot took a step closer, his sneer deepening. "Oh, there's definitely a problem," he snapped, his words dripping with disdain. "People like you don't belong here. This is first class, reserved for those who've earned it, not for charity cases or whatever this is." A shocked murmur spread through the passengers. Some turned away, visibly uncomfortable, while others stared unabashedly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, indignation, and disbelief. Barron's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't flinch. The challenge had been issued, and his next words would decide how this story unfolded. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, an almost tangible wave of shock and discomfort. Barron's heart sank, not out of fear or embarrassment, but out of something far more profound. He wasn't unfamiliar with judgment, but this moment felt different. The pilot's glare wasn't just about a seat or a ticket. It carried a venomous weight, something deeply personal and disturbingly hateful. Around him, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers a growing hum of speculation. A few quietly pulled out their phones, the soft glow of screens casting shadows over anxious faces. The air, once filled with the casual chatter of a pre-flight cabin, now buzzed with tension. Nearby, an older woman with kind eyes leaned slightly toward him, her voice low but urgent. "Are you okay, young man?" she asked, her hand resting lightly on the edge of his seat. Barron nodded, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Mom. Thank you." But the pilot wasn't done. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, each step amplifying the weight of his authority. He pointed a finger directly at Barron, his expression a mixture of disdain and finality, like a judge pronouncing a damning sentence. "I don't care who you think you are," the pilot spat. "You're not staying in this cabin. Either you move, or I'll have you removed from this flight." A collective hush fell over the cabin, the kind that comes only in the wake of raw, unfiltered hostility. Barron, who had remained composed thus far, finally shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat, his movements measured but commanding. At his full height, he was an imposing figure, his presence magnetic in the suddenly still cabin. Conversations ceased, and every eye turned toward him. Even the older woman beside him seemed to hold her breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm yet unyielding, each word carrying an unmistakable weight. "Sir," he began, locking eyes with the pilot, "I have a ticket for this seat. I belong here just as much as anyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." For a moment, the pilot froze, his face a mask of surprise that quickly hardened into a smirk. He crossed his arms, his stance defiant. "We'll see about that," he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. With that, he turned on his heel and marched toward the cockpit, leaving a palpable trail of tension in his wake. The cabin remained silent, the passengers visibly uneasy. Some glanced at Barron with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Others avoided his gaze altogether, pretending to focus on their in-flight magazines or the windows beside them. Yet no one spoke up, and no one intervened. Barron sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. He wasn't rattled, he was calculating. There was something unsettling about the pilot's hostility, something that felt larger than this moment. And Barron wasn't the type to let such things slide. Unbeknownst to the passengers, or even the crew, the confrontation they had just witnessed was only the beginning. A storm was brewing, not just in the skies above, but within the hearts and minds of everyone on board. What would unfold next would challenge them all, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew about justice, privilege, and courage. Minutes passed, but the tension lingered in the cabin like a storm cloud. The pilot hadn't returned yet, but his words hung heavy in the air. Barron noticed the anxious glances passengers were throwing his way. Some seemed sympathetic, while others looked hesitant, unsure of how to react. The flight attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, approached Barron cautiously. "Sir," she whispered, leaning down slightly, "is everything all right?" "I overheard what the captain said. If you'd prefer, I can see about moving you to another seat." Barron looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you," he replied softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to be here." The attendant nodded, a hint of admiration flashing across her face, but her concern remained. "Just let me know if you need anything," she added before hurrying back down the aisle. Then the unexpected happened. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing a delay. There's a security concern we need to address." Barron froze. Security concern? The pilot's earlier hostility suddenly made sense. He wasn't just being rude, he was trying to paint Barron as a threat, a calculated move meant to justify his actions. Passengers began murmuring again, their whispers growing louder as speculation spread. A man across the aisle leaned forward. "Is he talking about you?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and unease. Barron didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened the camera app. If things escalated, he wanted to make sure there was a record. Just then, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The murmurs turned into an audible buzz. Barron watched as the officers made their way down the aisle, their eyes scanning the passengers. They stopped in front of him. "Sir," one of them said, his voice professional but firm, "we need you to come with us." Barron's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He stood up calmly, his towering frame making the officers hesitate for just a moment. "Can I ask why?" he inquired. "We've been informed of a potential issue," the officer replied vaguely. The passengers were silent now, their eyes darting between Barron and the officers. Some looked outraged, others just stunned. But one voice broke through the quiet. "This is ridiculous!" It was the older woman who had spoken to Barron earlier. She stood up, her face flushed with anger. "That boy hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. It's the pilot who's out of line." Her outburst seemed to ignite a spark, and soon it spread like wildfire. From across the aisle, a man in a crisp business suit raised his voice. "Yeah, I've been sitting here the whole time. He's done nothing but mind his own business." His tone was firm, indignant, and it carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, more assertive. A woman with a toddler on her lap added, "This is ridiculous. He's not the one causing trouble. You are." Her words, though spoken softly, landed with precision, prompting a few nods from nearby passengers. The 2 security officers, who had arrived moments earlier with an air of authority, now looked decidedly uncertain. They exchanged hesitant glances, their confidence visibly shaken. One of them brought a hand to his radio, speaking in a low, clipped tone as if trying to navigate this unexpected turn of events. Barron stood in the center of it all, outwardly composed, his tall frame unyielding despite the tension crackling around him. But inside, a storm churned, not from fear or anger. He had faced far worse than this and come out stronger. No, What struck him to his core wasn't the confrontation or the hostility of those who opposed him, it was the support of strangers. These people didn't know him. They owed him nothing. And yet, here they were, standing up for him, challenging the injustice playing out before them. It was both humbling and deeply moving. And yet, Barron knew this was far from over. The pilot had yet to reveal his full hand, and something told him that whatever came next wasn't just about him. This situation was bigger, about power, prejudice, and a truth waiting to surface. The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point. Passengers whispered in hurried tones, their voices mingling into a chaotic hum. Others simply stared, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright defiance. The officers hesitated, visibly caught off guard by the growing wave of vocal support for Barron. The one with the radio turned his back momentarily, speaking into the device in what appeared to be an attempt to get further instructions. The other officer shifted awkwardly, his gaze flitting from Barron to the restless crowd, his grip tightening on the baton at his side. And through it all, Barron remained standing. He was a steady anchor in the storm, his calm demeanor almost unnerving in its contrast to the escalating chaos around him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't waver. But in his silence, there was power, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words. Unbeknownst to the passengers, or even the crew, this confrontation was building to a critical moment. A decision was looming, and it would affect more than just Barron. The truth, raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore, was about to come crashing down. The older woman, who had come to Barron's defense earlier, wasn't done. She stepped forward with surprising resolve, her shoulders squared and her voice cutting through the noise with authority. "I don't care who you think you are," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "This young man has been nothing but polite and quiet the entire time. If anyone should be escorted off this plane, it's that pilot." Her words landed like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that comes when truth is spoken so plainly it demands recognition. But then the murmurs began again, louder this time, rippling across the cabin like waves crashing against a shore. "She's right," a man called from the back. "We've all seen what's happening here." Another voice joined in, then another, until a chorus of indignation swelled. Passengers who had been silent now found their courage, their voices rising in unity against the injustice playing out before them. The pilot reappeared suddenly, storming down the aisle with a face as red as embers. His footsteps were heavy, his presence radiating fury. "Enough!" he roared, his voice slicing through the commotion like a whip. The passengers fell into a tense silence, but their disapproval lingered in their expressions and the occasional muttered comment. The pilot stopped abruptly, pointing a trembling finger directly at Barron. His anger was palpable, his hand shaking as though it could barely contain the rage coursing through him. "I don't care what these people say," he shouted, his words laced with venom. "This flight doesn't leave until he's off the plane." All eyes turned to Barron, who stood calmly under the weight of the pilot's accusation. His gaze was steady, unflinching, as he squared his shoulders and took a step forward. "And why is that?" Barron asked, his voice even but loud enough to carry through the cabin. There was no anger in his tone, only clarity and a quiet strength. "Is it because of something I've done? Or is it because of who you think I am?" The question hit like a hammer, the weight of its implications sinking into the room. The tension in the air became almost unbearable as the words lingered, unchallenged. The pilot faltered, his mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came. For a brief moment, the mask of authority slipped, revealing hesitation. But it was fleeting. His expression hardened once more, his features twisting with renewed anger. "Don't play games with me," he snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "You might have everyone else fooled, but I know trouble when I see it." The cabin was silent again, but this time it wasn't the hush of compliance. It was the quiet before a storm, a collective breath held in anticipation. Barron took another step forward, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Trouble?" he repeated, his tone carrying just the faintest edge. "No, sir. Trouble isn't me sitting in my assigned seat. Trouble is allowing prejudice and power to go unchecked." The passengers, emboldened by his words, began murmuring again, their voices building once more. The pilot's authority was unraveling before him, and for the first time, he seemed to realize it. But the battle wasn't over, not yet. What happened next would change everything for everyone on board. The truth was a storm, and it was about to break. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers shouted over each other, some calling for the pilot to be removed. The security officers looked overwhelmed, unsure of how to regain control. Then a man in the back of the cabin stood up. He was older, with a weathered face and the air of someone who had seen his fair share of battles. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, his voice deep and commanding. The noise subsided as heads turned toward him. "I recognize that young man," he continued, pointing to Barron. "And I think the rest of you do too. That's Barron Trump, son of the former President of the United States." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Barron felt a wave of unease wash over him as the revelation sank in. He wasn't ashamed of his identity, but he had wanted to avoid the spotlight, to simply exist without the weight of his last name. The pilot's face twisted into a sneer. "So what? That doesn't give him the right to act entitled." "Entitled?" the older man shot back. "The only one acting entitled here is you. I don't care who he is or isn't. Your behavior is unacceptable." The security officers seemed to sense the tide turning. One of them stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, we need to de-escalate this situation. If you continue to provoke the passengers, we may have to ask you to leave." The pilot's jaw dropped, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. This time, it was Barron. "I think we've had enough drama for one flight," he said, his tone measured. "If you'd like me to leave, I will. But know this, every moment of this has been recorded, and I won't let your actions go unanswered." The pilot looked as if he had been slapped. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder again, and passengers began holding up their phones, some openly filming the confrontation. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then the unexpected happened. One of the security officers turned to Barron and said, "You don't have to go anywhere, sir. Please take your seat." The cabin erupted into cheers, but Barron didn't move. Something told him this wasn't over yet. The pilot's eyes burned with fury, and Barron could see that whatever was coming next would be his final, desperate move. The pilot's fury boiled over. His face flushed red as he slammed a fist against the cabin wall. "This is my plane," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of his rage. "I decide who stays and who goes." The crowd's cheers turned to gasps of disbelief. Passengers began whispering to one another, their disdain for the pilot spreading like wildfire. The older man from the back stood again, raising his hand to silence the murmurs. "Your plane?" he said, his voice steady but biting. "Last I checked, this plane belongs to the airline, not to your ego. You're supposed to be a professional, but all I see is a man drunk on power, trying to humiliate someone who hasn't done a thing wrong." The words stung, and the pilot took a step back, momentarily lost for a response. But his silence didn't last long. "This isn't about power," he barked. "It's about rules, and I'm the one who enforces them." "Rules," Barron interjected, his voice firm but calm. "What rule did I break? Tell everyone here what I've done to deserve being singled out like this." The pilot hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The truth was, he had no legitimate answer. His actions had been driven by personal bias, and now, cornered by the weight of public scrutiny, he was struggling to find a way out. One of the security officers stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, you need to calm down," he said, his tone professional but stern. "You're creating a disturbance, and it's our job to ensure the safety of everyone on board." The pilot's face twisted in disbelief. "You're taking his side?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "We're taking the side of what's right," the officer replied. "And right now, you're the one jeopardizing this flight." The passengers erupted in applause, their support for Barron growing stronger with every passing moment. The pilot, clearly outnumbered and outmatched, looked around desperately, searching for someone to back him up. But no one did. Even the flight attendants, who had been silent until now, exchanged nervous glances before one of them finally stepped forward. "Captain," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret, "I think it's best if you step aside. This situation has escalated far beyond what's acceptable." The pilot's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again. But then something in his expression shifted. Perhaps it was the realization that he had lost control, or the sheer weight of the passenger's judgment pressing down on him. Whatever it was, he finally backed down. "Fine," he spat, his words dripping with bitterness. "Let him stay. But this isn't over." With that, he stormed out of the cabin, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. Barron exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the ordeal began. He turned to the passengers, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said simply. The older woman who had defended him earlier reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said warmly. "And don't worry, we'll make sure the world knows what really happened here." Barron nodded, his gratitude evident in his eyes. But as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot's ominous parting words were more than just empty threats. Something told him this battle was far from over. And as the plane finally prepared for takeoff, Barron couldn't help but wonder, what would the pilot's next move be, and how would it impact not just him, but everyone on board? The plane ascended smoothly into the skies, the tension in the cabin finally beginning to dissipate. Passengers exchanged relieved glances, some even offering Barron encouraging smiles. Yet, despite the calm exterior, an undercurrent of unease lingered. The pilot's parting words echoed in Barron's mind like a warning bell that refused to be silenced. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, their professionalism masking the storm that had unfolded just moments ago. Barron accepted a glass of water, his fingers brushing against the cup as he tried to ground himself in the present. Across the aisle, the elderly veteran who had first stood up for him raised his drink in a silent toast of solidarity. "Keep your head up," the man said softly, his voice carrying an air of wisdom earned through years of hardship. "Bullies like him thrive on fear, but you showed courage today." Barron nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. "Thank you," he replied. "I just hope this ends here." But it didn't. 30 minutes into the flight, a muffled commotion from the cockpit sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged hurried whispers, their composed facades cracking ever so slightly. One of them disappeared behind the cockpit door, leaving the others to reassure passengers that everything was fine. It wasn't. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The pilot's voice was laced with barely restrained anger, making the already tense atmosphere even heavier. "I want to apologize for the earlier disruption," he continued, his tone dripping with insincerity. "But let me remind everyone that rules exist for a reason. Some people think they're above them, but they're not." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the thinly veiled jab at Barron sparking renewed whispers. Barron, however, remained composed, his gaze steady as he stared at the front of the plane. The intercom cut off abruptly, but the unease lingered. Minutes later, the plane jolted unexpectedly, sending a wave of gasps through the cabin. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face pale as she tried to calm everyone down. "Just a little turbulence," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Barron wasn't convinced. His instincts told him something was off. Very off. And then he noticed it, the pilot's shadow through the frosted glass of the cockpit door, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The veteran leaned toward Barron, his voice a low whisper. "The man's completely unhinged. He's far from finished. You've got to brace yourself for anything." Barron's pulse hammered in his chest as he gave a quick nod, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd been through the grind before, public humiliation, relentless criticism, and unfair judgment. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just his reputation on the line. This was about his safety, and maybe even his life. The plane glided through the air, steady and calm, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but. The weight of the tension hung thick, suffocating everyone on board. Suddenly, with a deafening crash, the cockpit door flew open, slamming violently against the wall. The pilot stood in the doorway, his wild eyes and rapid breathing betraying his inner chaos. "All right," the pilot's voice cut through the silence, booming in the cabin. "If nobody else is stepping up, then I'll do it." Before anyone could comprehend his words, the pilot charged down the aisle, fury etched on his face. The passengers collectively gasped, their fear palpable in the air, but no one moved, no one dared to. The tension escalated to a boiling point as the pilot reached Barron, towering over him, his face contorted in a mix of rage and desperation. Barron felt the weight of the man's stare, the storm brewing in those eyes. There was no turning back now. The pilot wasn't just angry, he was out of control. And Barron had to figure out how to survive this. "You think you're untouchable?" The pilot sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Think again." But before he could take another step, the elderly veteran shot to his feet, planting himself firmly between Barron and the pilot. His voice rang out, strong and unwavering. "You've gone far enough." The cabin fell into stunned silence, all eyes on the two men, one a symbol of authority gone rogue, the other a quiet hero standing up for what was right. What happened next would not only define the rest of the flight, but also leave an indelible mark on everyone on board. The stakes were higher than ever, and Barron knew that this was no longer just about him. This was about standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. The tension in the cabin was electric as the veteran stood firm, his gaze locked with the pilot's. The passengers watched with bated breath, their fear and disbelief palpable. The pilot's rage simmered just beneath the surface, but the veteran's unyielding stance seemed to give everyone else a glimmer of hope. "You've crossed the line," the veteran said, his voice calm but commanding. "Sit down and do your job, or I'll make sure you never fly again." The pilot's lips curled into a sneer, but before he could retort, a young woman stood up, clutching her phone. "I've recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If you don't stop, this goes online, and your career is over." Her words rippled through the cabin, stirring whispers and nervous glances as passengers raised their phones. Some were already streaming the unfolding chaos live, capturing every moment. The pilot's earlier bravado faltered, his eyes shifting nervously toward the growing number of phones aimed directly at him. "You think you can threaten me?" He barked, but the edge was gone from his voice. It was clear he no longer believed his own words. "Enough!" A steady voice cut through the tension. The lead flight attendant appeared behind him, her presence commanding attention, flanked by two colleagues. "Captain, return to the cockpit now, or we will have no choice but to restrain you." The pilot froze. His fists clenched and unclenched as if he was trying to decide whether to resist or back down. His earlier bravado seemed to evaporate, replaced by the realization that he was rapidly losing control of the situation. The passengers' growing support for Barron and the looming threat of viral exposure left him with few options. After a tense pause, the pilot snarled, his frustration bubbling over. Without a word, he stormed past the attendants, retreating toward the cockpit, his back stiff with defeat. "You'll regret this," he spat over his shoulder, slamming the door behind him. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, but the tension remained. The veteran turned to Barron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well, son," he said. "Don't let people like him get to you." Barron nodded, his gratitude evident. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil. As the flight went on, the passengers began to rally around Barron, their words of support filling the air. The young woman who had captured the incident on her phone wasted no time in uploading the footage, and in mere minutes, it exploded across social media. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and soon hashtags like "Stand with Barron" and "Justice in the Skies" were trending worldwide, capturing the attention of millions. By the time the plane touched down, the scene at the terminal had transformed into a frenzy. A crowd of reporters and eager supporters had gathered, their eyes fixed on the gate where Barron was about to disembark. As he made his way down the jet bridge, a wave of cheers and applause greeted him. The noise was deafening, but Barron remained composed, his focus unshaken. The veteran walked beside him, offering quiet support, his presence a steady and unspoken testament to the bond they shared. A reporter, eager to capture the moment, quickly pushed forward, microphone extended. Barron, still processing the outpouring of public support, took a deep breath before turning to face the press. The veteran stood by his side, silent but resolute. The energy in the terminal buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited for Barron's first words after the dramatic flight. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Barron, but for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or mistreated. Barron, what do you have to say about what happened on the flight? The reporter's question hung in the air. Barron paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his expression thoughtful. After a brief silence, he finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying the weight of the moment. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "It's about standing up to injustice, no matter where it happens. No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human. We're all in this together." The crowd erupted in applause as Barron and the veteran walked away, their courage and resilience shining through. Their journey inspired all who witnessed it, reminding the world that strength and determination can overcome any obstacle. Their legacy of bravery would live on in countless hearts. Later that evening, Barron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through countless messages of support. He knew the fight against prejudice and injustice wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. And as he closed his eyes, he realized something profound. Sometimes the most unexpected battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And in those moments, standing up, even when it's hard, can change the world.